G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far you are having a brilliant week. Now of course we're coming off the back of a very big day yesterday, and what we started to see was the attritional nature of warfare start to bear fruit. But it's not just tactics, it's also exploitation of disadvantages of your adversary. And what we're going to look at today is how this is then unfolding, deteriorating and evolving over the past 24 hours. Of course, we'll be looking at maps. We'll be looking at what other than Aussies and bloggers, analysts are saying about the situation. We'll look at the units that have been redeployed in here to try and stabilize this. Of course, then we're going to go a little bit deeper again, and we're going to look at the foundations of attritional war, the very fundamentals of why war is fought and why attritional war is chosen and forced upon states as well. And then doctrines around then centers of gravity that go back a long time but are still relevant to warfare now. So there's a lot in that. I'm going to put that after the Pokrovsk update because I know I might lose a lot of people there, but I think it's very, very important to understand that to get an idea of what we are seeing, because you're looking for collapse, not breakthrough. And of course, then we're going to look at maps in other areas because the rest of the front line has not stopped. There are still updates on other sectors of the front. And as we go over in a warfare like this, you want to apply pressure everywhere, from tactically to strategically to politically. And we are seeing that now, and we are seeing that starting to bear fruit. So let's start right here. And we're going to start talking about Pokrovsk. Now, if you don't know the area I am talking about, we got a bit of ahead of ourselves. So, of course, here's Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 14. And the area which we are looking at is this envelopment here around Pokrovsk. And we saw where these bunny ears, as I've seen people saying it, have then shot out to Ukraine's first and final Donbass defensive line is Zoloty Kolodiyaz, and as well this highway from Dobropilya to Kramatorsk. Why is this important? Well, we have seen for months and months 1-2 kilometre grinding advancements, and then in a day somewhere between 12 and 19 kilometre shift. And this is something that we have been warning about for a long time, that territory is not the primary goal of attritional war. What you're trying to do is reduce your adversary's potential, and a byproduct of that will be eventually a collapse, and you will then achieve territory through that, but not through your own then breakthrough also. And we can go over at some point, I have gone over how tactically this is done. But last night, and this is coming tomorrow morning my time, so 12 hours from when you were seeing this video, I did a couple of hour podcast with a retired Swiss intelligence colonel, Jacques Beau, in his book and about his book called The Russian Art of War. And I just want to pull a couple of pieces from that interview and book out to talk about why this is important here. Now, a lot of people pushed back on what we'd been saying about this type of war for a long time. And I think this perfectly sums it up right in the beginning of the book. The adversary is so stupidly demonized that we fail to understand his way of thinking. As a result, we are unable to develop strategies, articulate our forces, or even equip them for the realities of war. And I think there's been so much complacency put into Russians can't operate drones, they can't do offensives, they are orcs on the front line. And this is what we are then being led into. But look at the frontline situation right now, and look at what is occurring in 3 days from now, or at least my time, maybe 4 days depending on your time zone, the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Tactical objectives must promote the achievement of operational objectives, which in turn must promote the achievement of strategic objectives of a political or military nature. Now, this is 101 Clausewitzian, that war is politics by other means. But you can see that tactics have to go into operational objectives. That then turns into the achievement of strategic objectives. That ultimately, the reason you fight war is for political objectives and influence. And we touched on a lot of these ideas in the podcast. And how his knowledge, his experience, and his writing of how war is not a photograph. It's more a film of these individual events, that 30 frames per second, but it works out like this from your tactics eventually leading into your politics and this holistic approach to war as well. And this area, currently in its nature, being surrounded like it is at the moment, is likely more valuable for Putin for this meeting in Alaska than actually if it just closed up and there was a withdrawal from Ukraine through Pokrovsk and Minograd at this point in time. Because it may show that, hey, Trump, I'm actually doing you a favor by not collapsing this massive encirclement that has now developed. And again, Trump, in his book, The Art of the Deal, he talks about aim higher than you want, settle for lower, so it makes it look like you have made the concession and that it's actually you giving them a good deal. Again, there's a lot of art of politics coming into this. Now, Zelensky, he's again reaffirmed that nothing can happen without Ukraine there, and again, that no territory is going to be given up, although there's some rumours around that is slightly shifting. But this was reported from the Financial Times. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed the advance on Tuesday, telling foreign journalists that the situation was the most complicated near the town of Dobropilya. I'll show you that. That's critical. He added that the Russian units had managed to advance about 10 kilometres deep and had been moving without equipment, with, quote, only weapons in their hands. Yes, this is infantry on light motorcycles and DRG elements, but supported by the equipment behind the line. Because they're only 10 to 20 kilometres away, drones and artillery can support them in that layered bubble of friendly forces, which we speak about as one of the doctrine points you need in attritional war. Zelensky directly linked the Russian offensive to the upcoming Trump-Putin talks in Alaska, saying it was aimed at shaping a narrative that Russia is advancing while Ukraine is losing ground in order to put political pressure on Ukraine and seek some concessions. And yes, political outcomes is why you fight war, but that this is not a narrative. Russia has been advancing while Ukraine loses ground for 2 years. And yes, you want to put political pressure, but the narrative of, oh, he just pushed here to create this short narrative of them making ground to influence this, I guarantee people have seen the kilometre square charts over the past few years. So, of course, you'll want to know what is actually changing on the maps. Well, we have the deep state map. Now, the deep state map, what you see on here, this is why we use this, because this is the baseline foundation of what the Ukrainian government is allowing to be released. So it is the absolute minimum, but it gives us a good baseline. So you can see just around the base a small bit of ground being made and around then Torets today. But we're looking at this area. So you can see the grey zone reaching out across the road from Dobropilya through to Kramatorsk, but nowhere near what we saw them confirm yesterday. Of course, what did I warn against yesterday? There will be two prongs trying to benefit off what is happening here. You'll have the Russian pages and Russian military trying to exploit the propaganda informational victories of this. And then you'll have the Ukrainian bloggers, government, and the propagandists, and that bloggers and propagandists in all of this, I think it's a massive overlapping table in that, due to what we see at the moment, but trying to play this down too. So the information fog of war at the moment is massive. But if we jump onto someone like AMK, let's have a look here. And you can see where it's showing that it is Russian movement up and cutting off this road, that Zoloty Kola Diaz coming further under control, and this push to the south of Dobropilya. So now Dobropilya is getting enveloped, as well as right across basically just to the south of Shevchenko, which is Shevchenko right here, putting massive amounts of pressure on Pokrovsk, Minograd, and of course increasing the vertical envelopment of Pokrovsk. As I've said, these distances here are enough to be travelled by drone, and these drones can effectively, strategically encircle and vertically envelop an area like this, increasing that rate of attrition. And that's why a lot of the time we don't see it actually push for a physical envelopment, because the goal is to reduce potential capacity. So another big update is this grey zone into Rodensky right in here. Of course, this is critical for Minograd. And what we can see is at this geolocation right in here, there was Russian forces come under Ukrainian artillery. So we can confirm there are definitely Russian forces present there. Of course, this puts huge pressure down in areas like Minograd. So let's actually step into one of the best overviews of this today from a Mr. Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow at a think tank and defence analyst. Russia's advance in Dobropilya reflects the broader problematic dynamic characterised by a lack of cohesive defensive lines and undermanned units holding terrain, which can result in gradual, then seemingly sudden shifts. What have we spoken about at length? Willie's theory of bankruptcy, little by little, then all at once. Now, I'm not saying this is the all at once. We'll go over what that may look like further on. But there are absolutely problems that we have been brought up for a long time that are now finally coming to the forefront. Again, you know, I'm a huge believer that sunlight is the best disinfectant, but the sunlight is now being brought to units being undermanned, fortifications being too porous, and command issues. And what I've said is those three issues take years to sort out, not months. Or not days. He continues. Advances around Pokrovsk had been blamed on Russian forces DRG, these diversionary reconnaissance groups, or recon sabotage we often call it. But these are often just small assault infantry groups, 2, 4, 6 men, or motorcycle barbecue groups, which can bypass the porous defensive line if they can get past the drone coverage. We know that the counter-drone warfare from Russia is world-leading, as well as those Rubicon units targeting as well Ukrainian drone operators and their own repeaters and electronic warfare. The line is more a series of pickets, often 2-3 man positions. Much of it is a grey area of overlapping defeat zones, so mutually supporting, covering forward and behind these initial positions. Enemy assault groups seek to get through these positions and keep advancing. But again, yes, I get that it's a series of these positions, but we didn't see through the Surovikin line then DRG elements by large amounts pushing 10, 15, up to 19 kilometres through these areas. That tells us about what he goes through next, about that Ukraine is holding the front line with the deficit of infantry, a lack of reserves by depending on drone units, something I've been warning about for a long time, the over-reliance on drones. That this has bought time, but it is not sufficient to stabilise the front or compensate for more fundamental challenges with force management and force generation, command, manpower. This recent advance appears to have been made by dismounted infantry and light motorised groups. Russian forces have progressed this year and done so faster, with much lower use of armoured fighting vehicles. This is the issue of treating armour availability as a key metric. And we see so many Aussinters, bloggers, analysts, YouTubers, whatever you'd like to call them, using armour as a key metric. And I've been warning against that because I said that it will either change due to force of battlefield or change due to force of industry. And you can't say that you're losing on a linear rate or constant rate this many tanks, they've got this many tanks, war end there, because this is what we have seen now, and a lot of the armour become irrelevant. Again, it may become relevant in the future. This advance cut through a defensive line of the map, which in practice, I added these lines, by the way, the road and the line, which in practice can mean little, because this is not a war of trenches held by infantry, but of well-masked positions for vehicles and small groups of infantry with large gaps in between. But if you can then accumulate large forces behind there, leverage off that, very, very important. And of course, the morale failure, seeing that these lines break through, is huge. Prepared defences, mines can canalise the advance, and mapping them is useful, but these lines on a map can also set the wrong expectations given battlefield dynamics. Hence, numerous groups of 2 or 3 men can walk through a porous line, along with the buggy or motorcycle units, if they are not intercepted by established defeat zones around those positions, or AFU drone teams are being suppressed. And I agree that what we have seen is these small groups of buggies or motorcycles push through that line. But why are we seeing it happen now? Because we didn't see it happen in 23, didn't see it happen in 24, didn't see it happen in 25. It's due to the nature of attrition that these lines just don't have enough eyes in the sky on drones or eyes physical on the ground from the fortifications themselves. No, you shouldn't be able to get a group with a buggy up through 20 kilometres and it not be just instantly seen and taken out in the fortification lines that we are currently seeing. The Russian forces also used glide bombs extensively in this direction to help set the conditions for this breakthrough. Contrary to rumours that occasionally crop up here, there has not been a significant reduction in their efficacy. There was a significant reduction around Christmas time, but we have seen with coordinate new antennas on them that come back to basically their original or better efficiency on the front line, and we're still seeing many of them dropped. There are other accounts who do a better job for daily tracking and updates. Suffice to say, information is delayed. There are rumours flying around, but expect the situation to be worse than what it is on Deep State. Yes, whatever Deep State is saying, it's going to be significantly worse than this. It's important to also point to a broader problem, which is the not one step back policy. Even when lacking the resources in disadvantageous terrain and near envelopment, rather than trading space for attrition or enabling commanders to conduct mobile defence. Too often, armed forces of Ukraine units are forced to maintain untenable positions where the elastic defence is behind their picket positions rather than in front of them. It also leads to false reporting of positions, distrust, and creates perverse incentives and misinform the system. Every time we talk about this, people have this idea that Ukraine is methodically pulling back and attriting the Russians. And what I say is, I don't know where you've got that idea, because the front line and the war in itself over years has not shown that at all. Look at Pokrovsk, look at Konstantinivka, look at Kupiansk, look back at Bakhmut, look at Avdiivka. You get the picture. You get this envelopment attrition down. Another issue is costly counterattacks to regain lost positions, including those which are untenable in the first place. Rather than focusing on stabilising the front, this has led to losses among a steadily shrinking infantry component of the force. The Ukrainian infantry has been shrinking, and costly counterattacks, as we say by the doctrine, on strategically unimportant areas may be optically important, and this is a major issue that we have. Mr. Tataragami UA writes, a collapse of the front is different in kind from a tactical breakthrough or breach. Could this advance lead to collapse if mishandled? Yes, it could deteriorate further, but equally it is too early to make that assessment. The next days will be very telling. Next weeks, I'll say. The defence of existing salients will prove even more difficult, and this breakthrough can lead to an accelerated withdrawal from those positions. The armed force of Ukraine is shifting units to counter the advance, and this is a sign of potentially worse things to come, that you overwhelm on many different areas at once and you create breakthroughs in different sectors. From this point, it's not difficult to see how this could further affect the defence of Donetsk, endangering Druskivka, then Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, especially considering the axis slowly pushing north of Liman. So Liman up here, and let me then show you that on the map. Let me clean this up, because what we have been speaking about is the war is if you have a holistic, almost an organism approach to pushes here and pulls there, this is what you get. Ukraine doesn't have, like I think a lot of people believe, some mythical entity of reserves sitting there in the tens of thousands to stabilise this. No. This is why I've always said the extending the front line for Ukraine for Kursk or other areas is unbelievably ridiculous. But these units have to move somewhere to stabilise this, leaving other areas already further thin. And we can see in what I refer to as the tourney front line in here, this is where this can threaten overall then a major northern axis of Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and of course, remainder of the Donbass for what would become a Liman front. I'll show you a map because other maps are saying Russia is having advancements in that particular sector today. Playfra, he says, the Russians entered Rodianske and advanced northwest of Chasiv Yar. So the map on the left, we're looking at then Rodianske. Almost all reports that I could find indicate an advancement from the east rather than from the north. That's the way I drew. So that movement, Rodianske, as I showed you, per the geolocation. Chasiv Yar, we spoke of this yesterday, Deep State confirmed this, very important fortifications were captured that belong to the first line behind the city. And as you can see, they were equipped with multiple lines of barbed wire, improvised covered ways of camouflage trench systems and dugouts in the tree lines, making them quite good fortifications. So they might seem like just fields, but it's more important than that. And that these fortifications behind Chasiv Yar have then fallen very quickly, taking into account relatively how slow everything moved through Chasiv Yar. You can see this in here today. I'll show you another map a little bit later, but this is what you get. It's pressure everywhere, and what gives may not be where you believe the main resources are sitting. This is why you don't want to sit all of your resources in one area. We'll go over the fundamentals and foundations in a second. According to my sources, the Zoloty Kolodiyaz breakthrough is mainly composed of Russian special forces, signalling that they used the best of the best for this, just like in an all-or-nothing push. So it's like a DRG, but much more dangerous. Now, this could be true. It could be an all-or-nothing Russian SF push, but also it could be rescuing some PR and some propaganda and some optics of this reporting as well. What we know is multiple times Ukraine over-reports Russia's strength in Sumy, Russia's strength on the front line, or massively on purpose overestimates the goals, going, hey, they want to capture Pokrovsk by this date. That no one's ever said, but when that then doesn't come, then you have an informational loss for the Russians. And what I would say is I don't see, from a former infantryman, this doesn't make sense for it to be a special forces mission. It makes sense to be more of a tier 2 recon group infantry, like specialized infantry mission. Your typical special forces mission isn't, the skills needed to conduct this isn't needed by that exact troop. A more recon element will be as good as anyone at doing that. And when we take into risk-reward ratio of losing these guys too, your SF is going to be more complex missions behind the line or stabilization in just significant tiny points at once, or working within larger teams. And we may then see it could be SF attached to a recon element to guide through too. Potentially, this is where it comes into play when there's so much fog. Rubicon units, so basically like the SF of drones, is doing the bulk of the job and is reportedly a pain in the arse. We know this has been transferred originally from up around Kursk down to here. Massive problems. All I know, again, I'll update you guys if I learn about anything else. What we know is Ukraine's redeployed a number of units, including Azov, to this sector to try and at least slow the movements. But again, this creates other vulnerable sectors. And Deep State has today said we may face a moment where Dobropilya falls faster than Pokrovsk. And you can just see, you don't need to be a military analyst to see, if Dobropilya up here falls faster than Pokrovsk, the depth of envelopment that is going to be happening, the pocket in here. And without wanting to pull back, then the benefits of the attritional nature of this. Mr. Clement Molan says, it must be said that for several weeks now, there's already identified significant vulnerability in areas. And he published this map of 1,000 airstrikes right in this area. And he was predicting pushes in here due to the amount of these airstrikes coming forward. That plays directly into what we call the paint by number strategy of the drones, the heavier artillery such as barrel and fab, and then infantry DRG elements, then moving and exploiting on that as well, and the simultaneous and successiveness of further assaults. Let's continue. He goes, there's been a long debate with several analysts I followed to determine if this is a breakthrough and if there is consolidation, given that there's no geolocated video. So are the Russian forces consolidating this far behind? One thing which tends to give an idea that this is happening is that Deep State, who of course want to control the narrative as much as anyone, haven't shown it as grey. They've shown it as red controlled. We can talk about a breakthrough since the front was breached over several days, starting around June 30. Russian soldiers are now operating behind the lines without us really knowing where they are, if this information was not verified. Why would Deep State publish a zone controlled by the Russians of up to Zloty Kolodiaz? Why would the 1st Azov Corps and 2 units be announced as reinforcements if it wasn't actually consolidating? Why would a series of Ukrainian analysts and soldiers speak about it and the systemic problems? Why would President Zelensky acknowledge the Russian breakthrough to Dobropilya? So it does look like this isn't, as Mr. David D., who the god of all analysts apparently, as this is just a short, tiny raid that's already been crushed. We will see, but it doesn't seem like it. The Russian advance primarily threatens to further fragment the Donbass front by visibly and clearly bypassing the fortresses at their western high point. Via monsters at here, you can see that dozens of Russians are present in the breach. And where this has then moved, and you can see where the high ground is sitting, down into the remainder of the Donbass, and where on the tourney front, as we call it, where that will push and exploit further. Now, high ground is very important because war these days is a lot of radio frequencies for repeaters and drones and just physical intelligence surveillance as well as plunging fire, or filleted fire, as well as then Russia's counter-drone electronic warfare. You have the high ground, you don't get dead ground right behind it. Very, very important areas. And we see that Ukrainian reinforcements are then coming into these areas here. First Corps National Guard, you can see where Azov is coming in, you're deploying a lot of these. But what is happening here? This is going to create thinness on other areas. Now, we missed it in the beginning, but of course, Mr. Suryak Map, he has shown this as well. Now, he doesn't show what AMK is showing. He shows more similar to what Deep State Maps is showing at this point in time, although a little bit more around Belitsky and Rodansky and a bit more around Rusin Yar Poltavka that he showed evolving in that one and the map before also. And what I keep saying is that this is attrition bearing fruit. And if you ask me, what does the map look like? It's probably more similar to Mr. AMK's, this push, then Roryanske Dobropilya, than what it's looking like right in here. But this is attritional nature of war bearing fruit, and the political outcomes from the achievement of tactical, then operational, strategic into political objectives coming through. And I thought I'd give you a bit of a baseline of this for your own knowledge moving forward for my own channel, or for if you're consuming other media out there, which you absolutely should be consuming, from mainstream to bloggers to YouTubers to analysts to a bit of everything, pro one side, pro the other side, and make up your own mind about this. Collapse without breakthrough. Once the decision is made to go on the offensive in an attritional war, and this can take a long time, it can take years before there's actually movement. The method of attack differs fundamentally from the classic maneuver warfare idea of a single powerful breakthrough. The guiding doctrine is to induce a systematic collapse of the enemy's front rather than achieving one deep penetration. So you want to have a systemic collapse. I think I said systematic, sorry, a systemic collapse of the front, not focusing on achieving a singular deep penetration. Practically, this means launching the offensive across a broad front with multiple simultaneous thrusts that are limited in depth. Simultaneous, successive. Instead of concentrating overwhelmingly at one point, the attacker applies pressure at many points along the enemy's line. So you've got pressure everywhere and waiting for this like a stack of cards. Once local attack aims to advance a short distance, enough to capture forward positions or force a withdrawal of assailant, while remaining under the cover of the attacker's protective bubble of air defences, EW, artillery. And in that artillery, of course, is drones, barrel, glide. So you're within that protected bubble still. You only advance in that. But of course, you're forcing withdrawals, or you're forcing attrition, forcing collapse, not achieving this, achieving that. You may achieve it, but it's by byproduct, okay? That Russia's successes are as much down to their tactics as failures and exploiting errors on the Ukrainian side around manpower and command. By pushing forward on a wide front, but only to shallow depths, the attacker avoids overextending into the range of enemy reserve fires and keeps their forces supported by intense friendly fire support. The intent of the broad front, shallow attacks, is to stretch and strain the enemy's defences to the breaking point, when the enemy has very few reserves left and any local crisis can set off a chain reaction. A breakthrough at one sector forces the enemy to urgently shift whatever reserves they have left to contain it, but in doing so they weaken other parts of the line, which then comes under attack and starts to buckle. So this is what we see. So we've seen this right here. I wouldn't be surprised to just see if we see a really hard push in Kupiansk or maybe a crossing of the Dnieper. The cascading effect means that what begins as a series of modern advances can snowball. As soon as one section of the front collapses, neighbouring sectors are increasingly likely to give way in turn. Morale effects compound the physical attrition. Defenders see previously fortified lines being overrun and may begin to question whether any position can be held. The idea, as the author from Rusi puts it, not the author of this, but what this is referenced a lot of, is if we can't hold the mega fortress, how can we hold these new trenches? Once psychological defeat sets in, an organised retreat can degenerate into general rout. At that moment, a true collapse is underway. The enemy front disintegrates, not because one armoured spearhead reached Berlin in a single dash, but because the entire army loses cohesion under relentless multi-directional pressure. It is only after the enemy front has collapsed in this manner that deeper exploitation objectives should be pursued. Once wide gaps open and adversaries in full retreat, operational freedom of manoeuvre can be regained, allowing armoured and mechanised forces to drive forward rapidly into the enemy's rear areas and capture critical nodes and compel surrender. And of course, with this in drone warfare, this is going to come much, much later than it may in other wars. As stated here, however, it is imperative the commanders avoid tipping their head too early by massing it for a singular breakthrough attempt. A concentrated attack in one place, if launched prematurely, gives the enemy a clear focal point to reintroduce and could reinforce and bog down, so one sector. Now, is armoured mechanised warfare, can they reintroduce that? Maybe so. We see Russia's building a shitload of armoured vehicles that are not being deployed. Maybe so. There is a real risk of it. I don't think Ukraine's degraded enough in their drones at this point in time, but again, we will see. The broad front doctrine prevents the enemy from predicting where the main effort lies. Indeed, in this model, every sector threatened becomes a main effort until the enemy collapses everywhere at once. This approach was demonstrated effectively in certain of the First World War offensives, as discussed below, talking about then things like the Brusilov offensives, and that it isn't just a single main effort, because if it's a single main effort, it's easy to counter. Well, it's easier to counter, but there's so many areas that if you push here, we'll pull there. And exactly what I said, when Ukraine went into Kursk, I said the best thing for the Russians to counter this tactically, push in the Donbass, because you will force reinforcements to go back into that area. Now, this is only awarded to the side that has numerical superiority. A lot of people today are saying Ukraine is going to push back into Russian territory along the border. That may have early success. It may distract some areas, but it will fall to this exact same fate that Kursk did. The doctrine of attritional warfare outlined in this paper highlights a fundamental paradigm shift in command and strategy for protracted high-intensity conflicts. Unlike wars of manoeuvre, attritional wars are won by the side that can endure the longest and manage its resources the smartest. Success in such warfare hinges on careful long-term planning, robust industrial capacity, and well-organised mobilisation structure, as established before the conflict and relentlessly expanded during it, and flexible enough to change during it as well. Critical requirements for victory include the ability to field a massive army through a high-low mix of elite and mass formations. So not just all good, you need wars like this are won by having the best low-end mass force. The discipline to avoid wasteful operations, even if an opportunity is presented itself, not to fall into this trap of just trying to gain an optical victory, and the patience to delay decisive offensives until favourable conditions are achieved. Military operations under this doctrine prioritise the destruction of enemy forces and war-making capacity over the occupation of land. Indeed, terrain is often irrelevant except where it enables or constrains the enemy's resources. To execute an attritional strategy, commanders must cultivate a defensive mindset that views time as an ally, using it to strengthen their forces and erode the component, and erode and rot from within. This runs counter to the instincts of many Western military professionals who are taught that defensive action is the key to victory. Yet, as global power balances shift and peer adversaries rearm, the likelihood of short, decisive wars diminishes. Future great power wars, or even middling states, will be protracted and costly, and that we need the best high-low end and able to have simple enough equipment to get it into power and simple enough doctrine to get lower trained forces into the power, into the war, and into the fold as well. On the other hand, a state that masters the attritional art of war will force its opponent into an unwinnable war of exhaustion. In the end, the side with the greater endurance, smarter resource management, and unified strategic will is the one that will emerge victorious. As one analysis warns, Western militaries must urgently re-examine their assumptions and start preparing for a protracted war of attrition rather than assuming conflicts will be over in a month, and also the assumption of air superiority as well. In attritional warfare, hope is not a strategy. Only rigorous preparation and steadfast execution of this doctrine can secure victory. Now, attritional war does have some areas too where it does excel in the ability to influence negotiations by degrading your adversary massively as well. Of course, there are massive drawbacks in post-war attrition of economy and state. And this is really interesting from an officer in the Swedish Armed Forces who sent this across to me about more fundamentals of war too. About border crossings. At one point, the lads from RWA brought up a long time ago that the 91 border in the northeast heavily benefit Ukraine. A lot of heights on the Ukrainian side. A Russian advance would, in a lot of places, be literally an uphill battle. Their point fairly early on that the Kursk offensive was that it was extremely by the Ukrainians to surrender that advantage by going on the offensive, a viewpoint that aged extremely well. If you look at terrain in Sumy, the Russian advance seems to be more focused on seizing hill areas. On a general note regarding these border crossings, Clausewitz had a term called Schwerpunkt, sorry to all the Germans out there, roughly translated to centre of gravity. This refers to different things, but are usually used for describing part of the front line that the largest strength of the armed forces is gathered. This can refer to firepower, manpower, or certain important divisions or something else. There are different ways to deal with the Schwerpunkt of the enemy, so the centre of gravity. Some theorists claim that the Schwerpunkt should be ignored, the centre of gravity, the most powerful point, and it is better to focus your attacks on the weaker parts of the enemy front. Other theorists claim that you should focus your efforts on the Schwerpunkt, on the centre of gravity, in order to deprive the enemy of their strongest force. The Russian focus on Donetsk Oblast proves to me that the Russians are using the original definition, namely focusing on the Schwerpunkt. This makes sense, considering how they see the connection between negotiations and military effort, this holistic view between tactics leading to politics, and how the Russians see no problem with negotiations going on while guns are being fired. That war is a continuation of politics by other means. All this is to say that these border crossings are probably an attempt to improve the defences by seizing favourable terrain in order to stop the Ukrainians from doing any new border raids. Also, exhaustion tying up. The possibility to force Ukrainians to transfer reserves can also be useful. But the fall of Kharkiv or Sumy City is a long way off, if you ask me. Of course, if the war continues on this trajectory, these cities will eventually fall. But by that time, the war will most likely be radically different from how it is now. We're going to go further down on this idea. I should clarify one thing about Schwerpunkt. The way the term is used nowadays is different from the way that Clausewitz used it. It is popular to talk about the Schwerpunkt of the military, but Clausewitz talked about the centre of gravity of the nation as a whole. So, for example, the Schwerpunkt of the Inca Empire was their Sun King. Once Pizarro got his hands on him, the empire crumbled. The Schwerpunkt of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was its aristocracy, once Charles XII attempting to secure votes for his candidate on the Polish throne. The Schwerpunkt of the Soviet Union was the Communist Party, and so on. So what is the Schwerpunkt of Ukraine? Since at least 2014, that has been, in my opinion, Western influence. that has shown with Victoria Nuland, Hunter Biden, Boris Johnson breaking up deals, the USA paying salaries and so on. The problem facing Russia is that Ukraine's Schwerpunkt cannot really be touched by Russia. They don't have a counter to it, and they can't really target it. Therefore, they focus on the next best thing, namely the armed forces of Ukraine. In a way, the armed force of Ukraine is the first line of defence for the NATO and EU influence and the attritional nature of destroying the potential there. If the Russian armed forces march into town, the US State Department will have their influence severely limited. Now, this may be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your perspective. This might be why the Russians don't seem to care too much about who is in power in Ukraine and why they focus on military and territorial control of annexed oblasts, both in attrition and annexations of areas too, and why all this is playing at once. So very interesting. Thank you to that gentleman. Incredibly knowledgeable to send that over to me, of course, incredibly anonymously. So let's then have a look at the remainder of the maps. Of course, we spoke about Chasiv Yar. We can see Suryak then confirming this movement of Chasiv Yar and this push in the direction of Konstantinivka as well in this other pocket that is and has been getting developed. The other area which incredibly it should be incredibly concerning, Kupiansk, another regional hub, a very important area. We can see Suryak saying that the Russian army had managed to advance inside and reach then the train station in here on the northwestern side. We've seen DRGs working in here. This is being ignored, but it plays into that idea of pushing on many different sectors at once. Move our way back down. We'll come, of course, past Pokrovsk and we'll come to Velika Novosilk. You can see the then border with Dnipropetrovsk Oblast here. You can see Suryak is saying some ground is being made here, as well as ground being made south of Komi-Shukivka as well, which we come down south just in here too. So expanding that one small advancement and fattening that is what we will see happen across here to desaturate forces too. But then we need to come up to the Laman-Aterney front we typically talk about, and you can see where this envelopment has been occurring as well as the envelopment of Siversk. And let's have a look at some of the updates in here. So we'll look on the southern side and then we'll actually go into the advancement itself. So around Terney, following complete withdrawal of Ukrainian army in the last 3 days, Russian army took full control over the locality of Torshke. So he's saying, you can line up where these reservoirs is, Torshke, that all this grey zone, he's saying Ukraine's pulled out of here and that Russia has made ground in here. And again, we know in the direction of Liman and around Sloviansk, of course, building down the line the further pressures of what we're seeing occurring in Pokrovsk actual. We'll move our way up into, of course, the envelopment that is happening in here. And we have the Borisivkia front line. Of course, you've got Zeleny Hay sitting in here. And Suryak is showing some advancements in here. This advancement is then confirmed by this geolocation right here, just right on the green and grey outskirts. And we can see this is from then Russian national flags and unit flag, I believe, from memory, being raised in Zeleny Hay just in here too. So confirming that advancement. But all eyes are on Pokrovsk. But that is also one of the issues, that all eyes are there. It'll be interesting to see what happens somewhere else and how this is going to be leveraged as a element of diplomacy in Alaska Friday. Legends, a lot as always, and I know a lot that can be pretty dull, but it's very important to understand these fundamentals as well. Have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.